In the unforgiving mountains of Colorado Territory, 1889, where winter winds could freeze a man's soul, and silence stretched for miles between neighboring ranches, 16-year-old Clara Whitman had learned that being different was considered a burden too heavy for most families to bear. He sold her like livestock to settle his gambling debts, trading his stepdaughter's future to the highest bidder without a moment's hesitation. On the treacherous mountain road to her new prison, a blizzard would change everything. He was the last man anyone would expect to care about a deaf girl's fate. When the wagon carrying Clara broke down in the killing cold, only one cabin showed a light in the endless white wilderness. The home of Samuel Garrett, a rancher so reclusive that most folks had forgotten he existed. The buyer was a stranger from the remote mountain valleys, a man whose reputation for cruelty preceded him like smoke from a wildfire. Born without hearing in a world that valued a woman's ability to follow spoken commands and respond to a husband's voice, Clara had become nothing more than damaged goods in her stepfather's cruel calculations. When the debts mounted higher than the snow-capped peaks surrounding their failing homestead, her stepfather made a decision that would haunt Clara's nightmares for years to come. But fate has a way of writing stories that no one expects. Samuel had spent 7 years in complete isolation after losing his wife and unborn child, speaking to no one, trusting no one, wanting nothing more than to be left alone with his grief and his cattle. What happened in that snowbound cabin would transform two broken souls and prove that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in forms the world refuses to recognize. If you believe everyone deserves to be valued for who they truly are, hit that like button, share your thoughts about how we treat people who are different, and subscribe for more stories that restore faith in human kindness. The Colorado mountain wind cut through Clara Whitman's thin wool coat like icy daggers as she huddled in the back of the creaking wagon, her hands tied with rough rope that had already rubbed her wrists raw. Jeremiah Hawkins, the man who had purchased her like a head of cattle, drove the team of horses with the same brutal efficiency he applied to everything else in his life. But she could feel the vibrations of their distress through the wagon boards beneath her. She had learned long ago to read the world through her other senses. The way shadows moved to signal approaching storms, the tremor in floorboards that warned of angry footsteps, the subtle changes in air pressure that meant danger was coming. His reputation as a man who broke women's spirits was well known throughout the territory, though few dared speak of it openly. Clara couldn't hear the howling wind or the horses' labored breathing as they struggled up the treacherous mountain trail. The vibration through the wooden boards was different, a sliding, sickening sensation that made her stomach lurch with terror. Clara felt herself thrown against the side rails as the wagon overturned, spilling its human cargo into a snowdrift that cushioned her fall but couldn't protect her from the bone-deep cold that immediately began seeping through her inadequate clothing. She saw Hawkins's back go rigid as he fought to control the team, his curses lost in the wind that she couldn't hear but could see in the violent way his mouth moved. Clara watched Hawkins's shoulders grow more tense with each mile, saw how his hands gripped the reins with increasing desperation as the storm intensified around them. Part of her, the part that had been beaten and sold like property, whispered that she should simply walk away and let the mountain cold claim the man who had purchased her for his own twisted purposes. She couldn't offer him words of comfort or reassurance, but her gentle touch spoke volumes about the kind of person she truly was, beneath the surface that others saw as damaged or broken. The storm was worsening rapidly, and she knew that exposure would kill them both within hours if they couldn't find warmth and protection from the wind. But his injuries had left him disoriented and fearful, and he responded to her attempts at communication with the same suspicious hostility that had marked their entire journey. That's when she saw it, a thin column of smoke rising from a valley perhaps half a mile distant, barely visible through the swirling snow, but unmistakably evidence of human habitation. Probably called down some Indian curse on us with those hand gestures. Hawkins's ignorance didn't change the fact that they both needed help, and she was the only one capable of seeking it. Checking one final time to ensure that his wounds were properly bound, Clara rose to her feet and began the treacherous journey through the snow toward the distant cabin. Light glowed warmly in the windows, promising heat and shelter, and possibly the salvation of two lives that hung in the balance, but felt in the deepest part of her soul. Clara, my darling, being different doesn't make us less human. She could only hope that whoever lived inside would notice the storm-battered girl who had appeared on their doorstep, like an answer to a prayer they had never thought to speak. Sometimes it makes us more human, because we understand what it means to suffer. Justice of a sort delivered by the same wilderness that had claimed so many others who underestimated its power. In her experience, most people saw her deafness as either a curse to be feared or a weakness to be exploited. She could only pray that whoever lived in that isolated valley might be different, that they might be willing to help two strangers, even if one of those strangers could never thank them with spoken words. The patterns in the sky, the way the horse's ears kept flicking nervously. The snow was already knee-deep and getting deeper with each passing minute, and Clara's thin dress and worn boots provided almost no protection against the elements. But she had survived 16 years of being unwanted and misunderstood. She could survive this too. Blood stained the snow around his head, dark red against pristine white, and his movements were weak and confused as he tried unsuccessfully to free himself from the wreckage. The taste of metal in the air, all signs that a blizzard was building to unleash its full fury on anyone foolish enough to be caught in the open. But Hawkins had only struck her across the face and told her to keep her devil gestures to herself. Right now, every sense she possessed was screaming that something terrible was about to happen. His eyes widened with surprise as she knelt beside him, her small hands working to clear away the debris that pinned his injured leg. She couldn't lift the heavy wagon tongue that had him trapped, but she could see that he was bleeding heavily from a gash on his forehead, and the bitter mountain wind was already turning his exposed skin blue with frostbite. The horses were exhausted, their breath coming in great clouds of steam that instantly turned to ice crystals in the frigid air. The lead mare stumbled, recovered, then stumbled again, her legs trembling with fatigue and cold. She had tried to warn him hours earlier, using the hand signals her late mother had taught her to communicate when words failed. Now, as the wagon wheels struggled for purchase on the increasingly slick trail, Clara realized that Hawkins's ignorance might kill them both. Clara felt the exact moment when the wagon wheel hit the patch of black ice. The wagon tilted sickeningly to the left, hovering on the edge of disaster for what felt like an eternity before gravity claimed its victory. Hawkins wasn't so lucky. Clara saw him pinned beneath the overturned wagon, his leg bent at an angle that made her wince with sympathetic pain. For a moment, Clara simply lay in the snow, watching her captor struggle. But her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Not heard, Clara struggled to her feet, her movements clumsy in the deep snow, and made her way to where Hawkins lay trapped. Working with the methodical precision her mother had taught her, Clara tore strips from her own petticoat to bind Hawkins's wounds. As she worked, Clara's keen eyes scanned the surrounding landscape for any sign of shelter. Clara tried to communicate her discovery to Hawkins through gestures, pointing toward the smoke, and then miming the act of walking. "Get away from me, you cursed mute," he gasped, his voice weak but still filled with venom. "This is your fault." Clara felt the familiar sting of rejection and misunderstanding, but she pushed the hurt aside. Each step was a battle against the wind and cold that tried to drive her back. As she struggled through the drifts, Clara's thoughts turned to the unknown person whose cabin offered their only hope of survival, The smoke grew larger as she approached, and Clara could finally make out the outline of a sturdy log cabin nestled against a grove of pine trees that provided some protection from the wind. Clara reached the cabin door just as her strength gave out, collapsing against the heavy wooden barrier with hands too numb to knock. Samuel Garrett had been carving a piece of pine wood by the firelight, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions that helped quiet the ghosts in his mind, when his dog Rex suddenly lifted his head and growled low in his throat. Rex never growled without reason, and the way the old hound's ears were pricked forward suggested something more than just a curious deer or prowling mountain lion outside. Samuel's weathered hands stilled on the carving knife as he followed the dog's gaze toward the cabin door. 7 years of solitude had sharpened Samuel's instincts for detecting anything unusual in his isolated world. Samuel rose from his chair with the careful movements of a man whose body bore the scars of too many hard winters and harder memories. At 42, his dark hair was already streaked with silver, and deep lines around his pale blue eyes spoke of years spent squinting against mountain sun and wind. A young woman lay crumpled against the doorframe, her dark hair plastered against her skull with snow and ice, her lips blue with cold. Her dress, once probably a decent calico, was torn and soaked through, offering no protection against the killing cold of the mountain storm. The girl's eyes widened slightly, and she nodded once, a sharp movement that conveyed both confirmation and a lifetime of being different in a world that valued conformity above all else. He'd learned that their silence didn't indicate stupidity or inability, quite the opposite in most cases. But he'd never been called upon to communicate with one, especially not under circumstances this dire. He hadn't spoken to another human being in 8 months, not since the supply wagon had made its last run, before winter set in. Rex whined softly and followed as Samuel carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the wind that tried to steal what little warmth his cabin contained. Samuel leaned closer, thinking perhaps the cold had stolen her voice, but then he noticed something that made his chest tighten with understanding. She was making deliberate hand gestures, her fingers moving in patterns that seemed purposeful despite their trembling from cold and exhaustion. When he shook his head to indicate he didn't understand, frustration flickered across her face. Not anger, but the weary disappointment of someone accustomed to being misunderstood. "Need to get you out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." She folded down her thumb, leaving 4 fingers up, then folded down another finger, leaving 3. "You're not alone," he said slowly. "There's someone else out there." Samuel followed her gaze, but could see nothing except swirling snow and darkness. She continued until only 1 finger remained, then pointed to herself again and shook her head. Her face showed distress as she pointed to her own head and made a motion like liquid flowing. There was something about her obvious vulnerability, combined with the fierce intelligence in her gaze, that awakened protective instincts he thought had died with Emma and their unborn child. But he also saw the desperate pleading in the girl's dark eyes, the way she was prepared to go back out into the cold herself if he wouldn't help. The girl watched his every movement, and when he held up the garment and gestured toward her wet dress, she nodded understanding. Samuel wrapped her in one of his own coats, the garment swallowing her small frame, but providing desperately needed warmth. She pretended to drive something, hands gripping invisible reins, then made a motion like something overturning. In the space of an hour, she had awakened feelings he'd thought were buried forever, protectiveness, curiosity, and something else he couldn't quite name. She pointed to herself, then made the driving gesture, then shook her head and pointed to a different spot, indicating she hadn't been the one controlling whatever had crashed. She pointed repeatedly toward the door, her message clear. They needed to help whoever was still out there. The sight that greeted him when he opened the door nearly stopped his heart. When he turned around, the girl was sitting wrapped in Emma's nightgown, her wet clothes hanging by the fire. She looked impossibly young and fragile in the oversized garment, but her eyes remained alert and watchful. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" But it was her eyes that captured Samuel's attention. Dark brown and alert, despite her obvious exhaustion, tracking his movements with an intelligence that reminded him painfully of his late wife, Emma. This girl was conscious, aware, and looking at him with a mixture of hope and wariness that suggested she had learned to expect disappointment from the world. "Jesus," Samuel breathed, his voice rusty from disuse as he knelt beside the collapsed figure. The girl's mouth moved, but no sound emerged. She was trying to communicate, and Samuel suddenly realized why no words had come from her lips. "You can't hear me," he said softly, more to himself than to her. Samuel had encountered deaf people before, during his years working cattle drives that took him through various frontier towns. Without hesitation, Samuel scooped the girl into his arms, surprised by how light she felt, even through her waterlogged clothing. The girl's eyes never left his face as he settled her in the chair closest to the fire, and Samuel found himself moving more gently than he had in years. "You're half frozen," Samuel said, knowing she couldn't hear him but needing to speak anyway. He moved to his bedroom and returned with one of Emma's nightgowns, simple white cotton that he'd kept all these years because throwing it away felt like another small death. Samuel turned his back to give her privacy, busying himself with stoking the fire and preparing hot broth from the venison stew he'd made earlier. She held up her hands and began making those same deliberate gestures, her fingers moving in what Samuel was beginning to recognize as a complex form of communication. Then she did something that surprised him. She pointed to herself, then held up her hand with all fingers extended. Samuel stared at her for a moment, then understanding dawned. The girl nodded frantically, then pointed toward the door and made a gesture that looked like someone lying down. "Someone's hurt," Samuel said, and the relief in her eyes told him he'd understood correctly. "Bleeding." She nodded again, then stood and moved toward the window, pointing out into the storm. The girl returned to his side and began a series of more complex gestures. "You were in a wagon," Samuel said slowly, piecing together her story. "Someone else was driving. It crashed." The girl nodded, then made a gesture that Samuel interpreted as urgency. Samuel looked at the storm raging outside his windows, knowing that venturing into that white hell was likely a death sentence for anyone foolish enough to try. "Show me," he said simply, reaching for his heavy coat and boots. The girl's face transformed with relief and gratitude. She moved quickly to where her dress was drying, pulling it on over Emma's nightgown despite its damp condition. As they prepared to venture back into the storm, Samuel found himself wondering about this strange, silent girl who had appeared at his door like a ghost from another world. What he didn't yet realize was that saving whoever waited in the snow would be only the beginning of a transformation that would change both their lives forever. The rescue nearly killed them both. Samuel and Clara fought through drifts that reached Samuel's chest, following Clara's precise directions, communicated through hand signals that somehow made perfect sense in the howling wilderness. Samuel tended Hawkins's broken leg and head wound, while Clara heated water and prepared bandages with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to be useful despite others calling her worthless. "I paid good money for that deaf mute," he snarled at Samuel. "No paper says she's property either," he replied quietly, his hand resting on his rifle. "Papers say slavery ended, and last I checked, white women weren't livestock. She's my property now, bought and paid for. No piece of paper says otherwise." Can't hear, can't speak proper. What use is a woman who can't follow orders or cry out when... For 3 days, they nursed the ungrateful man back to health, Clara anticipating Samuel's needs without words, while he marveled at her intelligence and compassion. I want you to stay." When they found Hawkins pinned beneath the overturned wagon, barely conscious and turning blue from cold, Samuel understood immediately why this girl had risked everything to seek help. Together, they managed to free the injured man and drag him back to the cabin. When Hawkins finally recovered enough to travel, his true nature emerged with venomous clarity. Samuel felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. "She's damaged goods," Hawkins spat. "Get out!" Samuel's voice carried the kind of quiet menace that made smart men reconsider their life choices. "Take your horse and get off my land. If I see you again, we'll have a different kind of conversation." After Hawkins disappeared into the winter landscape, Samuel found Clara standing by the window, tears streaming down her face. She turned to him and for the first time spoke, her voice rusty and uncertain, but clear enough to break his heart. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered, each word an obvious struggle. "No one wants me." Samuel reached out and gently lifted her chin, meeting her dark eyes with his own. "That's not true," he said softly. Spring came early to the Colorado mountains that year, and with it, a transformation that amazed everyone who knew Samuel Garrett's story. The reclusive rancher, who hadn't spoken to another soul in years, was now seen regularly in the town of Cedar Falls. More importantly, she had taught him a new language, not just the hand signals that allowed them to communicate, but the deeper language of understanding that comes when two broken souls recognize their perfect complement in each other. Accompanied by a young woman whose silent grace and quick intelligence quickly won over even the most skeptical residents, Clara had blossomed in the warmth of Samuel's acceptance, learning to manage his household with an efficiency that freed him to expand his cattle operation. The smile that spread across her face was brighter than the spring sunshine, and when she signed back her response, Samuel's own face lit up with joy. The town had initially whispered about the peculiar arrangement, but those whispers died when people saw how Clara's silent presence had healed something fundamental in Samuel's spirit. She said, "I'm her greatest gift too," and she's right. We saved each other. The bitter, isolated man had been replaced by someone who smiled readily and spoke with gentle authority about the remarkable young woman who had become the center of his world. All eager to witness the union of two souls who had proven that the greatest treasures often come disguised as burdens the world refuses to recognize. Their love story became legend throughout the Colorado mountains, proof that sometimes being different isn't a curse to be endured, but a blessing waiting for the right person to see its true value. Clara was in the garden, her hands moving gracefully as she tended the vegetables she'd coaxed from the mountain soil, and marvel at the joy that radiated from every corner of the property. Samuel would tell them the story of the girl who appeared at his door during the worst storm in memory, not as a beggar seeking shelter, but as an angel bringing salvation to a man who had forgotten how to hope. "Clara isn't poor, and she's not charity," he said, his voice carrying across the yard to where Clara worked. "Drop a comment below about someone who saw your true value when others couldn't. Hit that like button if this reminded you that love sees what others miss. Subscribe for more incredible stories that show how the broken often become the healers and how the unwanted become the most precious. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their worth isn't determined by what others think they lack, but by the love they're capable of giving and receiving. Your story matters. Tell us about it in the comments. She's the smartest, kindest, most capable person I've ever known. She's not my burden, Reverend. She's my greatest gift." When the Reverend made an unfortunate comment about that poor deaf girl Samuel had taken in out of charity, the transformation became complete on a warm May afternoon when Reverend Thompson visited to discuss the annual church social. Samuel's response was immediate and unequivocal. Clara looked up from her garden at the sound of her name, and Samuel repeated his words in the sign language she had patiently taught him. "What did she say?" the curious Reverend asked. Samuel watched Clara return to her gardening, his heart full of a contentment he'd never thought possible. By autumn, Samuel and Clara were married in a ceremony that brought together half the territory years later. When their own children played in that same garden, some hearing, some deaf, all loved equally, travelers would stop at the Garrett Ranch. This story proves that our differences aren't flaws to hide, but gifts waiting for the right person to treasure them.